So this is the first sewing project that we will work on from your sewing kit. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a needle case. And so this is what it will look like when it's finished. And it has 2 pieces of felt and it has a little piece of flannel in between. So we're going to learn how to do the sewing and some buttons. So thread. Thread comes I'm sure you've seen this, it comes on a spool, or the kind that we're going to be using, and this kind of thread, also spool thread, has just one little thin strand that comes off the spool at one time. So that's spool thread. We could use spool thread for this project, but we're not. We are going to use what's called embroidery thread or embroidery floss. It comes in what's called a skein, and it's just looped around. So when you take it apart, it's helpful to have something to put it on, like this card, because it can get really tangled. So embroidery floss has 6 different little threads all twisted together. Okay, so this is the kind of thread we're going to use, and I'm going to show you how we're going to use it. You're going to pull off a piece of thread from a card, right? And you don't want it to be too long. If it's too long, it can get really tangled. So you want it to be no longer than your arm, okay? So here's my long piece. I have long arms. So then what we're going to do is, for this project, we want to use 2 pieces. So I've got 2 pieces of thread together, and I'm going to start to pull these apart, and you can see they want to get tangled right here. So I'm going to grab the ones that I don't want. Let's see if I can make a big mess out of this. Here's the nice thing. If you're sewing with somebody, they can hold this other end for you, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to pull apart your thread. So, pulling apart thread, blah, blah, blah. But if you're alone, sometimes it's easier to just pull 1 strand at a time than 2 at a time. So if you're sewing and you're by yourself and you don't have anyone to help hold the thread, then I would just do 1 strand at a time, because this gets tangled. It's kind of annoying. Just so you know. And that's really tangled. There we go. Okay, so here I've got my 2 strands of thread, and I'm going to get a needle, and I want a needle that has a big enough eye so it's easy for me to put both the strands into. So let's say you're having trouble pushing them through. You can lick the ends of the thread to help stick them together, and that will help them push through. If this end is super fuzzy and it just doesn't want to push through at all, you can take your little scissors and you can cut a fresh start. So you just cut the end off, the fuzzy end, and it will be easier to thread your needle, okay? So once you've threaded your needle, we're going to pull the cut ends all the way to the other cut ends. So I've got all my cut edges down here at the totally opposite from my needle, okay? And I'm going to tie a knot. I tie a knot by making a loop and tucking the tail under and just making a knot like this. Some people have really fancy ways of making knots. I don't. And the cat you see in the background is Merlin. And I don't know why he wants to be in this video, but I guess he does. So we have our thread. We're ready to go. And you guys should have 2 pieces of felt and a piece of red flannel. The red flannel has a zigzag edge cut because it helps keep it from fraying, and I'm going to set it up so that it looks like this, and then I'm going to make a flannel sandwich, and I'm gonna put the wool on top here. Then, with my knot on the back, and the cat is really trying to get into the video now, so excuse me. There he is, trying to help. So I'm gonna pull the thread through, and my knot is on the back, just like that. And I'm just gonna take a little stitch, and I'm gonna pull it through like that. And then I don't need to look at the other side, but I wanna come up kind of in a straight line. And I'm stitching at about 1/4 of an inch from this edge, but you guys can just eyeball it. It should be kind of close to the edge, but you should make sure that you're getting all of your layers, okay? And then I'm gonna just keep stitching along until I get to the other end. And so this kind of stitching is called a running stitch. It just goes along and it looks like a dotted line. So I take a stitch and skip a stitch, take a stitch, skip a stitch, and on the back side are the opposite stitches, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna just keep going. And there's a faster way of doing this, but this is a little bit thick. Sometimes I can take a stitch like this, and instead of pulling it through to the other side, I can just sort of bend my fabric and push my needle through. So I just pull it through like this. And it just pushes the needle along a little faster. It's harder to do it on this thick wool though, so if you can't do it, don't feel bad. When you get to the end of your stitching line, you're going to turn this over, and if you see that you've got some extra threads over here, sometimes you can go in and you can just kind of snug this up. Here's the thing though, you don't want to pull the thread too tight. If I pull the thread too tight, it's going to look like this, and that's kind of ugly and it doesn't lay flat. If that happens to you, it's okay, because you can kind of just go back and smooth it out like that. All right? At the very end, you're going to want to take a little stitch in place like this, and then before you pull it tight, see how you've got that loop right there? You want to pull your needle and thread through here, because that is going to make a little knot. And I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to take a little stitch just like that, make a little loop, and then I'm going to sew through this loop, and then that part's done. Then I'm going to pick 2 buttons, and buttons can be like this and they can have holes in them, and buttons can also look like this. This is a little hard to see because it's black, but it has a loop on the back side like this. That's called a shank button, because it's a button that stands away from the fabric. You can pick either kind of button to put on your needle case, but I am just going to use a holey button. So I'm going to go ahead and tie another knot in my thread, and I'm going to keep my knot on the same side as my knots from sewing like that. And with holey buttons, I've sewn a lot of buttons, so I'm making it look pretty easy. Oops, my knot did not catch. If my knot doesn't seem big enough, I can go in here and I can tie another knot to try to make it a little bulkier. Sometimes felt pulls knots through pretty easy. And so I'm just going to take some stitches. You should do at least 2 stitches across each holes. I'm going to stitch a crisscross pattern on this button, but you can stitch whatever kind of pattern you want between the holes. Like that. If you decide to use a shank button, all you have to do is stitch around that bottom loop under the button. It's really easy. They're even easier than these hold buttons. So that's stitching the button on, and then I have to do the same thing on the back, where I take a little stitch and then I catch it up and turn it into a knot. I'm going to do that 2 times. It just makes things more secure in the end, and I just made that really messy. It's okay if it's messy. Sometimes the first time you do something, it isn't always very clean. So in order for me to get this finished, all I have to do is stitch on one more button. And what that does is it helps hold this in place, and it'll give me a really good place to put my needles. And it also can be a good place to put my spare thread. So when you're embroidering, sometimes you have extra thread and you're not going to use it all right away. Rather than throw it away, which is wasting it, I'm going to just stick it right in here like that, and then I close it, and then it won't get tangled or in anything else. So that's that. That's how to make a needle book.